You've imagined the moment, the one where it's done, where you have what you've been working toward, the relationship, the money, the title, the body, the house, the version of your life that currently exists only as a future you're building toward. You've imagined how it would feel. Here's what the research shows actually happens. Not to everyone, but to enough people with enough consistency that the pattern has a name. Several names across psychology, philosophy, and neuroscience. And what they all point to is the same uncomfortable truth. Getting what you want is one of the most psychologically destabilizing events a human being can experience. Not because the thing wasn't worth wanting, not because you didn't deserve it, but because the architecture of human motivation was never built for arrival. It was built for pursuit. And when the pursuit ends, when the goal is reached and the wanting has nowhere left to go, something in the system that made you who you are starts to come apart. The people who built their entire identity around a specific destination and then reached it know this feeling in a way that's almost impossible to describe to people who haven't. You got there, and that there wasn't what you thought it was. Not because it was worse, sometimes it was everything you'd hoped, but because getting there revealed something about the wanting itself that the wanting had been hiding the whole time. By the end of this, you'll understand the specific psychological mechanism that makes arrival dangerous, and what the people who navigate it well do differently from the people who don't. There's one finding from a 40-year study on human motivation that reframes everything about how desire actually works. We'll get there. Start with the story. In 1978, two psychologists named Philip Brickman and Dan Coates published a study that became one of the most cited papers in the history of happiness research. They compared three groups: lottery winners, people who had won between $50,000 and $1 million in the Illinois state lottery; paraplegics, people who had recently become paralyzed in accidents; and a control group of ordinary people who had experienced neither. The question was simple. How happy are you? How happy do you expect to be in the future, and how much pleasure do you get from ordinary daily activities? The results were not what anyone expected. Lottery winners were not significantly happier than the control group, and their pleasure in ordinary daily activities, eating breakfast, talking to a friend, watching television, was actually lower than both other groups. The paraplegics, meanwhile, reported significantly higher levels of happiness and anticipated future happiness than researchers had predicted. And their pleasure in daily activities was comparable to the control group. Brickman and Coates called the mechanism behind this hedonic adaptation the tendency of the human brain to return to a stable baseline level of happiness regardless of what happens to it. Good things happen. The baseline rises temporarily. Then it returns. Bad things happen. The baseline drops temporarily. Then it returns. The brain is not built to sustain the emotional state that getting what you want initially produces. It's built to move on, to recalibrate, to make the extraordinary ordinary so it can go looking for the next thing. This is not a flaw. It's the engine of human motivation. Without it, the first comfortable shelter would have ended all further building. The first successful hunt would have ended all further hunting. Adaptation is what keeps the species moving. But here's what it means for the moment you get what you've been building toward. The high doesn't last, not because you got the wrong thing, because the brain was designed to end the high, to clear space for the next wanting. And if there is no next wanting, if the goal you reached was the goal, the destination that was supposed to be the answer, the cleared space doesn't fill with contentment. It fills with a question. Now what? Psychologists call this arrival fallacy, a term coined by Harvard-trained positive psychologist Tal Ben-Shahar to describe the mistaken belief that reaching a goal will produce lasting fulfillment. Ben-Shahar first noticed it in himself. As a Harvard student and national squash champion, he had spent years believing that winning the Israeli National Squash Championship would make him happy. Not temporarily happy. Fundamentally, lastingly happy. He won. And the day after the victory, he described feeling an emptiness he hadn't anticipated and couldn't explain. Not depression, not ingratitude, just absence. The absence of the thing that had been organizing his life. He went on to study this experience systematically, and what he found was that arrival fallacy was not a personal weakness or a failure of character. It was a structural feature of how humans relate to goals. The goal doesn't just represent a desired outcome, it represents an identity, a reason, a story about who you are and where you're going. And when you arrive, when the outcome is achieved, the identity, the reason, and the story don't automatically update. They just stop. The person who spent 10 years building toward a specific version of success reaches that version and discovers that they have no idea who they are without the building. The pursuit was the self, and now the pursuit is over. Here's the neuroscience behind why this happens. The brain's reward system, the dopamine architecture that drives motivation, desire, and the feeling of moving toward something, is fundamentally anticipatory. Dopamine, contrary to popular understanding, is not primarily a pleasure chemical. It's an anticipation chemical. It fires in response to the expectation of reward, not the reward itself. Research by neuroscientist Wolfram Schultz at the University of Cambridge, spanning decades of work on dopamine neurons, found that dopamine activity peaks during the anticipation phase, during the pursuit of a goal, and actually drops at the moment of reward delivery. Not slightly, measurably. The neurological high of wanting is higher than the neurological high of getting. And when the goal is achieved and the anticipation ends, when there is nothing left to want in that particular direction, the dopamine system doesn't maintain its activation. It drops to baseline. You don't get what you were promised neurologically, not because the thing wasn't good, because the thing you were actually experiencing during the pursuit, the neurological state that felt so compelling, was the pursuit itself, not the destination. The wanting felt better than the having, and nobody told you that was coming. This is the mechanism beneath arrival fallacy. The brain runs on anticipation. When anticipation ends, the system that made the journey feel meaningful goes quiet. And in that quiet, people do one of two things. They either find something new to want, or they stay in the quiet long enough to understand what it's actually telling them. The people who find something new to want immediately, who achieve one goal and immediately redirect toward the next, don't experience arrival fallacy in its most acute form. They keep the anticipation system running. They stay in motion, but they pay a different price. Psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, the Hungarian-American researcher who spent decades studying optimal experience, described what he called the hedonic treadmill of external goals, the pattern where each achieved goal is immediately replaced by a larger one, producing a life of constant striving with no experience of genuine arrival. People on this treadmill are often high-functioning, highly productive, externally successful by almost any measure, and privately, many of them describe a creeping sense that something is missing. Not any specific thing, just something. A quality of presence or meaning that the achievement itself doesn't seem to provide. Csikszentmihalyi spent years trying to identify what that missing something was. His answer was the concept he called flow, the state of complete absorption in a challenging activity, where the difficulty of the task and the skill of the person are precisely matched, and attention becomes so fully engaged that self-consciousness disappears. Flow is not about outcomes, it's about process. The quality of engagement with what you're doing right now, independent of where it's going. And here's the finding that connects flow research to the problem of getting everything you want. People who report the highest levels of life satisfaction are not the people who achieve the most goals. They're the people who spend the most time in states of genuine engagement, absorbed, challenged, present, regardless of whether the activity produces external recognition or reward. The satisfaction was never in the destination. It was always in the quality of the doing. Now let's talk about identity, because this is where the problem of getting everything you want becomes most acute. When a person organizes their identity around a specific goal, when the answer to "who are you" is effectively someone who is working toward X, the achievement of X doesn't just end the pursuit, it ends the identity. This is documented most clearly in research on elite athletes after retirement. The post-athletic career transition has been studied extensively, and what the data consistently shows is that the most significant predictor of psychological difficulty after retirement is not the loss of income or the loss of structure or even the loss of physical capability. It's the loss of self. Athletes who built their entire sense of who they were around their sport, whose identity was the pursuit, experience something researchers describe as identity foreclosure when the sport ends. Not by choice, by circumstance. The self that existed had nowhere to go. A 2019 study published in the Journal of Applied Sport Psychology found that athletes who had developed what researchers called identity breadth, a sense of self that included the sport but extended beyond it, transitioned significantly better than athletes whose identity was entirely sport-dependent. The ones who struggled most were not the ones who cared most about their sport. They were the ones who had made their sport the only answer to the question of who they were. The same pattern appears in people who retire from demanding careers, in parents whose children leave home, in anyone who has organized the story of themselves around a goal that has now been reached or ended. Getting what you want, completing the pursuit that defined you, can leave you not just without a goal, but without a self. Here is the finding from the long-term study that changes how all of this should be understood. Beginning in 1938, Harvard Medical School launched what would become the longest-running study of adult life ever conducted. The Harvard study of adult development tracked 268 men from their college years through their deaths, measuring health, relationships, career outcomes, and subjective well-being across 8 decades. The study's director for much of its history, psychiatrist George Vaillant, published its findings in 2012. The question the study had been trying to answer for 80 years was straightforward. What makes a good life? Not a successful life by external measures. A good life, as reported by the people living it across all its stages. The answer was not achievement, not wealth, not the accumulation of what you wanted. It was the quality of relationships. Specifically, whether a person had at least one relationship in which they felt genuinely known. But the finding beneath that finding was the one that directly addresses the problem of getting everything you want. The men who reported the highest life satisfaction in their later years were not the ones who had gotten the most of what they wanted in their earlier years. They were the ones who had learned, usually through difficulty, usually through some form of loss or failure or unwanted arrival, that what they had been wanting was not actually what they needed, that the destination they had been pursuing was pointing toward something real, but was not itself the real thing. The real thing, in almost every case, was connection, presence, the quality of attention brought to the people and activities that made up their daily lives, not the outcomes those lives produced. The men who figured this out earliest lived the longest and reported the most satisfaction. The men who figured it out latest, who spent decades in pursuit of external markers before understanding what they were actually after, often described a specific regret. Not that they had failed to get what they wanted, that they had spent so long wanting the wrong things. Here is what all of this actually means. The problem with getting everything you want is not that the things aren't good. Some of them are genuinely good. Worth having. Worth the work it took to get them. The problem is what the wanting was for. If the wanting was for the thing, for the outcome, the achievement, the external marker, then getting it ends the wanting. And ending the wanting ends the neurological state that made the journey feel meaningful. and ending that state leaves a silence that most people have never been prepared for. But if the wanting was pointing toward something beneath the thing, toward connection, toward mastery, toward a quality of engagement with life that the goal was a vehicle for, then getting the thing doesn't end the wanting, it clarifies it. You reach the destination and realize that what you are actually after is still available, still reachable, not through a different goal, but through a different relationship with whatever you're doing right now. The people who navigate arrival well are not the people who wanted less. They're the people who understood at some level what the wanting was actually for. And that understanding, that clarity about the difference between the goal and what the goal was pointing toward, is not something you arrive at by achieving more. It's something you arrive at by sitting in the silence after achievement long enough to hear what it's asking. You've imagined the moment, the one where it's done, where you have what you've been working toward. Now you know what to do with it when it comes. Not to stop wanting, not to detach from outcomes or pretend goals don't matter, but to ask before the pursuit ends, what is this actually for? What quality of life am I using this goal to move toward? And when I get there, what will still be available to me that doesn't depend on getting the next thing? Because the wanting doesn't stop when you get what you want. It just asks a better question. And the people who hear that question, who sit with it instead of immediately replacing the old want with a new one, those are the people the research identifies as genuinely satisfied. Not eventually. Over time, in the accumulated texture of a life that knows what it's actually for. The problem with getting everything you want is that it forces you to find out what you actually wanted. And that answer, when you finally arrive at it, is worth more than everything you got to get there. If this is the kind of content that stays with you long after you stop watching, subscribe for new videos. This channel goes where the real questions live, and there's always another one worth asking. There is a concept in Buddhist philosophy, one that Western psychology has spent the last 30 years slowly arriving at through empirical research, called the second arrow. The first arrow is the pain of not having what you want. The frustration, the striving, the gap between where you are and where you're trying to get. The second arrow is the pain you add to that pain. The story you tell about what the wanting means, about whether it will ever end, about whether you are fundamentally the kind of person who gets what they want or the kind who doesn't. Most people, when they finally get what they want, discover that the second arrow has been there the whole time, hidden inside the pursuing, invisible beneath the motion of striving toward something. Because the second arrow isn't about not having, it's about the relationship with wanting itself. The person who gets everything they want and finds it empty is not experiencing a failure of the thing they got. They're experiencing a confrontation with the second arrow that the pursuit had been keeping them too busy to feel. The arrival strips the motion away. And in the stillness, the arrow becomes visible. Here's what the psychological research on post-achievement depression, a recognized but underreported phenomenon, actually shows about who experiences it most acutely. Not the people who wanted too much, the people who attached too completely. There is a distinction in psychology between what researchers call harmonious passion and obsessive passion. Harmonious passion is engagement with a goal that feels chosen, integrated into the person's sense of self, but not defining of it. The person pursues the goal because it aligns with who they are. But they remain who they are, independent of the goal. Obsessive passion is engagement that feels compelled. The goal has taken over. The person doesn't pursue it because it fits who they are. They pursue it because, without it, they don't know who they are. A 2003 study by psychologist Robert Vaillant at the University of Quebec found that people with harmonious passion toward their goals showed significantly better psychological outcomes, both during pursuit and after achievement, than people with obsessive passion toward identical goals. The difference wasn't in what they wanted. It was in how they held the wanting. Harmonious passion produces a person who can arrive and remain themselves, who can get what they wanted and find it genuinely satisfying, not because the thing delivered what it promised, but because the person receiving it was already whole enough to experience it fully. Obsessive passion produces a person who can't afford to arrive, because arrival ends the identity. The problem with getting everything you want is only as serious as the degree to which the wanting has replaced the self that was doing the wanting. And here is the final layer that the research points toward. The solution is not to want less, not to lower ambition or detach from outcomes or practice indifference to results. The solution, if it can be called that, is to develop what psychologist Carol Dweck at Stanford called a growth orientation toward the self. Not toward skills or abilities, though that's part of Dweck's work. Toward the self as an ongoing project, a continuous process, something that is never complete and therefore never in danger of the completion that empties it. The person with a growth orientation toward themselves doesn't experience arrival as the end of the story. They experience it as a chapter break, a moment of information, evidence about what the next pursuit should be, refined by what the last one revealed. They get what they wanted. They learn what they needed to learn from getting it. And they use what they learned to want more accurately next time. Not more desperately, more accurately. The wanting gets better, more aligned with what actually produces the experience of a life worth living. Less attached to the external markers, and more directed toward the qualities of engagement, connection, and presence that the markers were always trying to point toward. That is the only resolution the research offers to the problem of getting everything you want, not getting less, wanting better, and knowing before you arrive that the arrival is not the point. The point was always who you were becoming on the way there.